picture a cold December night in Washington, D.C. The year is 1913. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The streets outside the Capitol building are quiet. A thin frost has settled over the stone steps. The gas lamps throw small circles of yellow light onto the empty sidewalks below. Most of Congress has gone home for Christmas. The halls inside are nearly silent. A few men remain. They move through the corridors with purpose, their shoes clicking against the marble floors. Their breath comes out in small white clouds. Outside, the city sleeps under a pale winter sky. Inside, something enormous is about to happen, and almost nobody is watching. That night, a piece of legislation passed through the United States Congress that would change the way every single American lived, worked, borrowed, and spent money. It would shape wars. It would shape recessions. It would quietly sit behind every dollar bill ever printed from that night forward. The law was called the Federal Reserve Act, and the way it passed, the timing of it, the emptiness of those chambers, the men who stayed and the men who left, has been talked about in whispers ever since. Some people call it a conspiracy. Some people call it smart politics. Some people call it the greatest financial sleight of hand in American history. And some people say it was all perfectly normal, perfectly legal, and perfectly fine. Those people might even be right. But the story of how it happened is strange enough that it has never fully gone away. Here is the thing about secrets. The best ones don't hide in dark rooms. They don't live in locked boxes or buried files. The best secrets hide in plain sight. They sit right there in the public record, in the congressional minutes, in the newspapers of the day. They wear the clothes of ordinary events. They move through the world looking like nothing special at all. And then, years later, someone reads the fine print. Someone notices the date. Someone asks a simple question that turns out not to have a simple answer. That is exactly what happened here. The Federal Reserve Act was not passed in secret exactly. The vote was recorded. The signatures were real. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law the very same night. All of that is documented, sitting in archives right now, open to anyone who wants to look. But the circumstances around that vote, the men who weren't in the room, the men who were, the months of maneuvering that led up to that single December evening, that is where the story gets interesting in a quiet, slow-burning kind of way. Think about what it means to create a central bank. Think about what it means to hand a group of private institutions the power to control the flow of money across an entire nation. That is not a small thing. That is not the kind of decision you make on a Tuesday afternoon, while half the room is catching a train home for the holidays. And yet, in a very real sense, that is almost exactly what happened. The men who built this law had been working toward it for years. Some of them had met in secret on a private island off the coast of Georgia, traveling under false names, telling no one where they were going. Some of them were the most powerful bankers in the country. Some of them were senators. Some of them were both. In every way that mattered, they had a plan. And December 1913 was when that plan finally came together. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like the kind of story that belongs in a dark corner of the internet, the kind of story told by men with too much time and too little sleep. And maybe some of the people who tell this story do take it further than the facts allow. That is worth keeping in mind. But the core of it, the timing, the absences, the island meeting, the name changes, the rushed vote, all of that is real. All of that is documented. The mystery is not whether these things happened. The mystery is what they mean. That is the question that has followed this story for over 100 years now. So settle in. The night is cold. The fire is low. And somewhere in the marble corridors of a nearly empty Capitol building, a small group of men are about to do something that will echo through every generation that comes after them. Let's find out what they did. To understand what those men did, you first have to understand the world they did it in. Go back, way back, not to ancient history, just to the early 1900s, 100 and some years ago, close enough to touch, almost. Close enough that some of the buildings are still standing. Picture a small American town in, say, 1910. Not a city, a town. The kind with one main street and a church at each end. The roads are dirt, packed hard by wagon wheels and horse hooves. In the summer, they turn to dust. In the winter, they freeze into ruts that can snap an axle clean off. There are no traffic lights because there is almost no traffic. A motor car is still a strange and startling thing. Children run out to watch one pass. The storefronts have hand-painted signs. The butcher, the dry goods store, the post office, which doubles as the place where news arrives. Men wear hats every single day, not as a style choice, but as a simple fact of life. Women wear long skirts that sweep the wooden sidewalks. In the winter, everyone wears wool. Heavy, scratchy, warm wool that smells like lanolin and damp sheep when the rain gets into it. At night, the town goes dark in a way that is hard to imagine now. Kerosene lamps in the windows, candles on the tables. The streets themselves are black. The stars overhead are thick and bright. The Milky Way a white smear across the whole sky. You could read by moonlight on a clear night if you held the page just right. This is the world where money was a physical thing, not a number on a screen, not a balance in an account you check on your phone. Money was something you held, something with weight. A silver dollar sat heavy in your palm, cool and solid, stamped with an eagle and a woman in a crown. A gold coin caught the lamplight and threw it back warm and yellow. Paper money existed, but people were suspicious of it, and they had good reason to be. See, in those days, a paper bill was a promise. It said, right there on the face of it, that you could walk into a bank and trade it for gold or silver, real metal, real value. The paper was just a stand-in for something true and solid buried in a vault somewhere. People understood this. They felt it in their bones. Money meant something you could weigh. Banks were different too. Not the glass and marble towers you see today. A small town bank might be a single room with a wooden counter and a heavy iron safe bolted to the floor. The banker knew every customer by name. He knew which farmers were good for their loans and which ones drank too much. He knew whose crops had failed and whose wife had just had a baby. Lending was personal. Borrowing was personal. Money moved through a community like water through a field, slow and visible, touching everything. here is the thing about that world. It was fragile. Banks failed. They failed regularly, the way old barns fall in a hard winter. A rumor could start on a Monday morning that a bank was in trouble, and by Tuesday afternoon, there would be a line of people out the door trying to get their money out. If enough people panicked at once, the bank would run dry, and then it was gone, and the savings of a whole town went with it. This happened over and over again in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. Panics, they called them. The Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893. Each one left wreckage behind. Farms lost, businesses closed, families ruined. The economy of the whole country could shudder and crack like river ice in a spring thaw, and there was nothing to stop it. The federal government had no central bank, no single institution to steady things when they started to shake. The United States was, in this way, almost alone among the major nations of the world. England had the Bank of England. France had the Bank of France. America had a patchwork of state banks and private banks and national banks, all of them pulling in different directions, none of them answering to any single authority. It was a system built for a young country that didn't trust power. And by 1910, that system was starting to show its age. The men who understood money, the men who moved it and held it and lent it in enormous quantities. They had been watching all of this for a long time, and they had thoughts about how to fix it. Those men had names, and it helps to know them. Start with J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan. He was the largest figure in American finance at the turn of the century, and he looked the part. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a thick white mustache, and eyes that people described as two burning coals set deep in his face. He had a condition called rhinophima, which caused his nose to grow large and bulbous and red. He hated being photographed because of it. His nose appeared in cartoons, in newspapers, in the drawings that working people passed around when they wanted to mock the powerful. Morgan bore all of it without much visible concern. He had more important things to think about. Morgan moved through the world like a man who expected doors to open before he reached them. And they did. He wore dark suits and carried a cane he rarely needed. He collected art the way other men collected stamps, filling a private library in New York with paintings and manuscripts and ancient objects from every corner of the world. He smoked enormous cigars. He played solitaire on long train rides. He was not warm exactly, but he was decisive. In a room full of powerful men, Morgan was the one who ended the argument. He had already saved the United States government once, in 1895, when the Treasury was nearly out of gold. Morgan arranged a private loan almost single-handedly and steadied the whole country. He did it because he could. He did it because the alternative was chaos, and Morgan had no patience for chaos. Then there was Nelson Aldrich. He was a senator from Rhode Island, a thin man with a careful part in his silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested he had never once slouched in a chair. Aldrich had been in the Senate since 1881. He knew where every lever was, and he knew how hard to pull. He was not flashy. He did not give speeches that made people weep. He worked through committees and closed-door meetings and long dinners where the real decisions got made before anyone sat down at the table. Aldrich had married into money and then made more of it. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which tied him to the Rockefeller family and their Standard Oil fortune. This was not a small connection. This was a thread that ran straight through the center of American wealth. Then there was Paul Warburg. He was different from the others in ways that mattered. He had been born in Hamburg, Germany, into a famous banking family. The Warburgs had been in finance for generations, the kind of family where children grew up understanding interest rates the way other children understood fairy tales. Paul came to America in 1902 after marrying Nina Loeb, whose family ran the powerful investment bank Kuhn, Loeb and Company on Wall Street. Warburg was quiet and precise. He wore small, round glasses and spoke with a German accent that never fully softened. He had studied the central banks of Europe closely. He understood how they worked, why they worked, and what America was missing by not having one. He wrote papers about it. He gave speeches about it. He was, in some ways, the most purely intellectual of the group, the one who had actually done the reading. And these men did not particularly like each other. Morgan thought Warburg was too theoretical, too European, too focused on elegant systems, when what mattered was raw power and the willingness to use it. Aldrich was a politician first, which meant he was always calculating the angles, always thinking about what a thing would look like from the outside. Warburg thought the American bankers were brilliant, but undisciplined, like gifted musicians who had never learned to read sheet music. There were others, too. Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, one of the largest banks in the country. He was younger than the rest, ambitious and sharp, with a journalist's instinct for how stories moved through the public. Benjamin Strong, who ran Bankers Trust and would later become one of the most powerful figures in American monetary history. Henry Davison, a Morgan partner who had the rare ability to make everyone in a room feel like they were being listened to. These were the men, different in temperament, different in background, different in what they wanted and how they wanted to get it. But they shared one belief, held quietly and firmly like a card, kept close to the chest. They believed the American financial system was broken, and they believed they were the ones who should fix it. To understand why those men felt so certain, you have to go back to 1907. You have to feel what that year felt like from the inside. America in the early 1900s was a country moving fast, faster than it had ever moved before. Cities were growing like bread left in a warm kitchen. Steel mills burned through the night in Pittsburgh. Coal came up out of the Pennsylvania hills by the trainload. New York was building itself taller every year, floor by floor, steel beam by steel beam, reaching up toward a sky that seemed to have no ceiling. The streets smelled like horses, and coal smoke, and fresh bread from the bakeries that opened before dawn. The trolley cars ran on fixed schedules. The newspapers landed on doorsteps with a soft thump every morning. Life had a rhythm to it, a steadiness. People trusted that rhythm the way they trusted the sun coming up. Banks were part of that rhythm. You put your money in. You took it out when you needed it. The man behind the counter knew your name. He knew your father's name. The building was made of stone or brick, solid and cool in summer, and the vault door was thick as a man's arm is long. That door was meant to say something. It was meant to say, "This is safe. This will be here tomorrow." Most people believed it. Then October came. It started, as these things often do, quietly. A copper mining company in Montana ran into trouble. Two men named Hines and Morse had been playing a game with bank stocks, borrowing money to buy shares, using those shares as collateral to borrow more money, building a tower of debt that looked solid from the outside, but had nothing real holding it up. When the copper deal fell apart, the tower started to lean. Word spread the way bad news always spreads, faster than good news, faster than reason. People in New York started showing up at the Knickerbocker Trust Company. The Knickerbocker was one of the largest trust companies in the city. A grand building on Fifth Avenue with marble floors and high ceilings, and the kind of quiet dignity that was supposed to make you feel calm just walking through the door. But calm is a fragile thing. It only takes a few people asking for their money at once before the people behind them start to wonder why. By the morning of October 22nd, the line outside the Knickerbocker stretched down the block. Men in suits and women in long coats stood in the cool autumn air, waiting. The leaves on the trees along Fifth Avenue had gone gold and red. The sky was pale blue and clear. It was a beautiful day for a disaster. The Knickerbocker ran out of money before noon. It suspended payments. The doors closed, and the people who had been waiting in line went home with nothing. That was the match. The fire spread fast. Other trust companies saw the same lines forming outside their doors. Banks started refusing to lend to each other. Credit dried up the way a creek dries up in August, slowly at first, and then all at once. Businesses that needed short-term loans to make payroll couldn't get them. Factories started cutting hours. Workers went home early and wondered if they'd have a job next week. In small towns across the country, people felt it too, even if they didn't fully understand why. The hardware store owner noticed his wholesaler was slow to ship. The farmer noticed the price he got for his grain dropped without warning. feeling was like a cold draft coming under a door. You couldn't see it, but you felt it on your ankles. The whole thing might have collapsed entirely. Some people believe it would have, but one man stepped in. J.P. Morgan was 70 years old in 1907. He was a large man with a large presence, the kind of person who seemed to fill a room just by deciding to be in it. He gathered the heads of the major New York banks in his private library on Madison Avenue, a room full of dark wood and old paintings, and the smell of leather and cigar smoke. He locked the doors. He told them they were going to solve this together, or they were all going to suffer together. He made them pledge money to shore up the failing institutions. He decided, almost by himself, which banks would be saved and which ones would be allowed to fail. It worked. The panic slowed. The lines got shorter. The doors stayed open. But the men who watched it happen, the bankers and the senators and the sharp-eyed men who thought about money for a living, they walked away with a very specific feeling. They had just watched one private citizen hold the entire American economy together with his bare hands. And they knew that couldn't happen again. Nelson Aldrich had a mustache that meant business. It was thick and white and carefully kept, the kind of mustache that told you this man made decisions and expected them to stick. He was a senator from Rhode Island. He had been a senator from Rhode Island for nearly 30 years. And in 1907, watching the panic ripple through the country like a stone dropped in still water, he decided something had to change. He was not a soft man. He was not a man who worried much about the farmers or the factory workers or the people standing in lines outside the banks. He thought about systems. He thought about power. He thought about how money moved through a country and who got to decide where it went. And what he saw in 1907 scared him in a very particular way. It wasn't the panic itself that scared him. Panics happened. Banks failed. People lost savings. That was the rhythm of American life in those years, ugly as it was. What scared Aldrich was the solution. One man, one private citizen, one 70-year-old banker with a library and a cigar and a very firm handshake. That was all that stood between the American economy and total collapse. was not a system. That was luck wearing a good suit. Aldrich had a daughter named Abby. She married a man named John D. Rockefeller, Jr. You might recognize that last name. Aldrich moved in circles where men like J.P. Morgan were not unusual. They were just Tuesday. He understood that world from the inside, and that understanding told him exactly what needed to happen next. He needed to go to Europe. This sounds strange. A financial crisis hits America, and a powerful senator's first move is to book a trip across the Atlantic. But Aldrich was not running away. He was studying. He spent 2 years traveling through England and France and Germany, sitting with central bankers, asking quiet questions, watching how the old countries managed their money. He came home with notebooks full of ideas and a very clear picture in his mind of what America was missing. A central bank, a single institution with the power to create money, to lend to other banks, to steady the whole system when things started to shake. Europe had them. America didn't. And in Aldrich's mind, that gap was the problem. Now here is where the story starts to get interesting in a way that's hard to explain cleanly. Aldrich went public with some of his ideas. He talked about reform. He gave speeches. He let people know that change was coming, and the reaction was not warm. The word bank made ordinary Americans nervous in those years. The word central made them downright suspicious. People remembered old fights. They remembered Andrew Jackson killing the second bank of the United States back in 1836, calling it a monster, a creature that served the rich and crushed the poor. That memory was still alive. It lived in the bones of the country. So Aldrich had a problem. He had a plan. He believed in the plan. But the plan had a name that nobody would accept. And the people who needed to vote for it were afraid of their own voters. He went quiet for a while. That's the part worth noticing. A man who had been loud and public and full of speeches just went quiet. He stopped giving interviews. He stopped making announcements. He started having private meetings instead. Small dinners, closed rooms, conversations that didn't make it into the newspapers. There was a man named Frank Vanderlip. He ran the National City Bank of New York. There was a man named Henry Davison. a senior partner at J.P. Morgan's firm. There was a man named Benjamin Strong who also worked in Morgan's world. There was a man named Paul Warburg who had come over from a powerful German banking family and understood European central banking the way a carpenter understands wood. These men started appearing in the same places as Aldrich, not at public events, not in any official capacity, just around, just nearby. And then one November in 1910, Senator Aldrich told a small group of men to pack their bags. He told them to travel separately. He told them to use first names only, no last names, when they spoke to each other. He told them to act like they were going duck hunting. They were not going duck hunting. They were going somewhere quiet, somewhere off the coast of Georgia, somewhere the newspapers wouldn't find them and the public wouldn't ask questions. The bags were packed. The train was waiting. And something that would touch every dollar you have ever held in your hands was just about to begin. The island had a name that sounded like something from a story, Jekyll Island. It sat off the coast of Georgia, low and green and wrapped in Spanish moss. The moss hung from the live oaks like old curtains, gray-green and soft, swaying in the salt air. The beaches there were pale and wide. The water was dark near the shore, the color of strong tea. In November, the island was quiet. The summer crowds were long gone. The birds moved through the marsh grass without hurry. The whole place felt like it was resting. There was a club on that island, the Jekyll Island Club. Rich men had built it years before as a private retreat, a place to escape the noise of New York and Boston and Chicago. The clubhouse was a big wooden building, painted yellow, with wide porches and tall windows. Inside, the rooms smelled of cedar and fireplace smoke and something older, something that soaked into the walls over years of quiet money gathering in one place. The men who belonged to that club owned, by some accounts, roughly a quarter of all the wealth in the entire world. That is not a legend. That is just the math. In November of 1910, a small group of men arrived at that island. They came by private railcar. They came separately at different times, so no one would see them all boarding together. They used first names only. They told the staff as little as possible. They kept the curtains drawn on the train. A man named Davison, if anyone asked, was simply Henry. A man named Warburg was simply Paul. Senator Aldrich, the most powerful man in the group, was simply Nelson. They were, they said, going duck hunting. The locals on the Georgia coast knew something was different. People who worked the docks and the ferry lines noticed the kind of men coming through. These were not hunters. Hunters come with mud on their boots and easy laughs and a certain looseness about them. These men came with leather bags and serious faces. They moved like men who had somewhere to be. They spoke quietly. They tipped well, which the locals remembered, because men who tip well are usually men who want something kept quiet. The stories got passed around the way stories always do in small coastal towns, at the docks over coffee, at the general store between one errand and the next. Someone's cousin had driven a wagon for one of the men. Someone's neighbor had seen the lights on late in the clubhouse past midnight, when duck hunters would long since be asleep. The word that kept coming up, in the way people reach for a word when they don't have the right one, was secret. Something secret was happening over on that island. The old-timers in those Georgia communities had a saying about Jekyll Island. They said the island had always belonged to people who didn't want to be seen. Before the club, before the rich men from the north, the island had passed through hands quietly, one owner to the next, without much fuss or public record. There was something in the land itself, the old-timers said, that pulled private things toward it. The marsh kept its own counsel. The moss covered what needed covering. The tides came and went and didn't talk. That kind of talk is folklore, of course. Islands don't have intentions, but folklore has a way of pointing at something true, even when the words aren't literal. The men on Jekyll Island in 1910 were, in fact, doing something they did not want seen. They were writing a plan for a central bank, a plan that would reshape how money moved through every town and farm and factory in America. They worked for 9 days. The fireplaces burned through the nights. The marsh outside was cold and still. The birds moved through the grass without knowing what was being decided a few hundred yards away. Nobody outside that room knew the full shape of what was being written. The men inside the room barely told each other everything. Aldrich held the center of it. Warburg drew from what he knew of European banking. The Morgan men thought about stability, about control, about the kind of order that keeps large institutions from falling. Each man brought his piece. None of them had the whole picture alone. And when the 9 days were done, the men packed their bags again. They left separately. They went back to their lives in New York and Washington. They did not speak publicly about what had happened. The island went quiet again. The moss kept swaying. The tide kept moving. And somewhere in a leather bag, on a train heading north, was a document that most of America would not hear about for years. There is something old about the idea of a few men deciding the fate of many. It did not start in 1910. It did not start with Aldrich or Warburg or the Morgan men on a train heading south through the Georgia dark. It started much earlier than that. It started, in some ways, before America had a name. The land that would become the United States was always a place where power moved quietly. The people who lived here first understood this. The Haudenosaunee, the great confederacy of nations in the Northeast, built a system of shared governance that stretched across hundreds of miles. Decisions were made in council. Words were chosen carefully. The men and women who held influence did not always hold titles. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room was the one who said the least. When European settlers arrived, they brought their own ideas about power. They brought the idea that wealth could be written down. That land could be owned on paper. That a signature on a document could change who controlled a river, a forest, a mountain range. This was a new kind of thinking, and it moved fast. The early American colonies ran on barter and credit and a dozen different currencies at once. Spanish coins, British pounds, tobacco leaves pressed into value. Wampum beads traded between nations. There was no single system. There was no center. Money was whatever two people agreed it was, and that agreement could fall apart by morning. The founders knew this was a problem. Alexander Hamilton knew it better than most. He was a young man from the Caribbean, sharp-eyed and restless, and he understood that a nation without a stable currency was not really a nation at all. In 1791, he pushed through the first Bank of the United States. It was controversial the moment it was born. Thomas Jefferson hated it. He saw it as a tool for the wealthy to tighten their grip on ordinary people. The argument was loud and bitter, and it did not end. The first bank lasted 20 years. Congress let its charter expire in 1811. 5 years later, a second Bank of the United States opened its doors. Andrew Jackson killed it. He called it a monster. He said it served the rich and strangled the poor. When he shut it down in 1836, people cheered in the streets of cities and in the fields of farms. The idea of a central bank felt, to many Americans, like something foreign, something European, something that did not belong here. And so, the country ran without one for the better part of a century. It ran through booms and crashes, through the chaos of the Civil War, through the wild expansion of the railroads, through the silver debates and the gold debates, and the long arguments about what money should be made of and who should control it. The economy grew enormous. It also broke over and over in ways that hurt ordinary people most. Every panic, every crash, every bank run left a mark. The panic of 1873, the panic of 1893, and then 1907, which you already know about. Each one added weight to the argument that something had to change. Each one gave the men with the leather bags and the long train rides a little more room to work. This is the older current running beneath the Jekyll Island meeting. It was not just 9 men in a hunting lodge making something new. They were reaching back into a very long argument, an argument about who controls the money, about whether that control should be public or private, about whether ordinary people should have a say in the systems that shape their daily lives. The answer, in most of history, has been no. Not because of malice, necessarily, but because the people who understand complex financial systems are usually the people who built them. And the people who built them to serve themselves first. This is not a conspiracy. It is just how power has always worked in every civilization, on every continent, going back further than anyone can clearly see. What made America different, or what was supposed to make it different, was the idea that the people had a voice, that the government answered to them, that decisions of this size could not be made in private rooms by private men. And yet, here was a document riding north in a leather bag, written in secret by men who had pretended not to know each other, written on an island most Americans had never heard of, written without a single vote being cast. The old argument was still going. It had just moved indoors. There was a man named Arsene Pujo. You may not know that name. Most people don't. But in 1912, he was a congressman from Louisiana, and he had a question that kept him up at night. The question was simple. Who actually controls the money in this country? Pujo ran a committee, a subcommittee of the House Banking and Currency Committee, and he started pulling on threads. He called bankers to Washington. He sat them down under bright lights and asked them questions they did not want to answer. He found things, not hidden things exactly, things that had been sitting in plain sight, like a stone in a field that everyone had agreed to walk around. What Pujo found was a web. A small group of men, maybe a dozen at the center of it, who between them controlled an enormous share of American banking, American railroads, American insurance. They sat on each other's boards. They lent each other money. They made decisions together in rooms that had no windows facing the street. The press called it the Money Trust. That name stuck for a while. Then it faded. Names like that tend to fade. But here is the thing about Pujo's investigation. It happened at the same time that a bill was moving through Congress. A banking reform bill. A bill that was supposed to fix the exact problems Pujo was uncovering. And that bill had a strange habit. It kept changing its name. It started as the Aldrich Plan, named for Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, the same Aldrich who had organized the trip to Jekyll Island, the same Aldrich whose son-in-law was John D. Rockefeller, Jr. When people heard the name Aldrich attached to a banking bill, they did not feel warm about it. Aldrich was not a man of the people. He was a man of the banks. everyone knew it, so the name changed. The bill came back as the Glass-Owen Bill, named for Carter Glass of Virginia and Robert Owen of Oklahoma. Glass was a Democrat. Owen was a Democrat. The bill now wore a different coat. It looked like reform. It looked like something the little man might want. Some of the language was different. Some of the structure was adjusted. But the core of it, the beating heart of the thing, was not so different from what had been written on that island in Georgia. The name had changed. The men presenting it had changed. The essential idea had not changed very much at all. A journalist named Alfred Owen Crozier noticed this. He wrote a book about it in 1912. He laid out the connections, the overlaps, the way the Aldrich Plan and the new bill rhymed with each other in ways that seemed like more than coincidence. He was not a wild man. He was not shouting from a street corner. He was a careful writer with a careful argument. His book sold some copies. It was reviewed in some papers. Then it was mostly forgotten. The way careful arguments often are when they arrive at inconvenient times. There was also a congressman named Charles Lindbergh, not the aviator, his father. Charles August Lindbergh of Minnesota. He stood up on the floor of the House and said things that made the room uncomfortable. He said the bill was a gift to the bankers. He said it would give private men control over public money. He said the name had changed, but the nature of the thing had not. He had a plain face and a plain voice, and he meant every word. People listened. Some of them agreed, but the bill had momentum now. It had the right names on it. It had the right party behind it. It had a new president in the White House who had run on reform and meant to deliver something that looked like it. The bill changed its name one more time before the final vote. Small adjustments. Language softened here, sharpened there. Each version was presented as a correction of the last one. Each version was said to be better, more balanced, more fair to the ordinary American who just wanted to keep his savings safe and borrow money at a decent rate. By the time it reached the floor for a real vote, most people had stopped tracking the changes. The debate had gone on for months. People were tired. The holidays were coming. The bill had a new name and a new face, and long history that most members of Congress had not fully read. It was ready, and the calendar, as it happened, was about to become very important. There is a man named Thomas Crawford who shows up in the historical record only once. He was a clerk in a congressional office in Washington in the winter of 1913. He kept a diary. Most of it is ordinary stuff: the price of a meal, the weather, a note about his landlady's cat. But in December of that year, he wrote something that people have passed around ever since. He wrote that the building felt empty. He wrote that the hallways had a hollow sound, the way a church sounds on a Tuesday. He wrote that he could hear his own footsteps. He had worked in that building for 3 years, and he had never heard his own footsteps before. That detail stays with you. A woman named Edna Marsh was the wife of a junior congressman from Ohio. She wrote letters home to her mother every week without fail. Her letters from December 1913 are careful and polite. The way letters are when someone is writing for history without knowing it. She described the train ride home. She described the relief of leaving Washington. She wrote that her husband had been told the important votes were finished for the year. She wrote that he was glad to be coming home. She wrote that the children would be so happy to see him. She did not write about the Federal Reserve Act. She may not have known it was still moving. There is a congressman from Georgia, a man named Thomas Hardwick, who did stay. He voted no. He said afterward that the timing had felt wrong to him from the beginning. He said December felt chosen. He said the holidays had a way of making men want to go home, and that wanting to go home was a powerful thing to use against a man. He said he had watched colleagues leave one by one through the first weeks of the month. He said the chamber grew quieter every day. The way a fire burns down slowly, and you don't notice until the room is cold. He was not a dramatic man. He said these things plainly in interviews and in letters without anger. He just said what he saw. A journalist named Charles Seymour wrote a short piece for a small paper in late December of that year. He noted that the vote had come on the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. He noted that the Senate gallery had been nearly empty. He noted that the men in the gallery who were there did not look ordinary citizens who had wandered in to watch their government work. They looked like men who had been waiting. He wrote that they sat very still. He wrote that they did not speak to each other, but seemed to understand each other anyway. He filed the piece. It ran on an inside page. Nobody wrote back. There is something in all these accounts that feels the same. Not fear, not outrage, just a quiet noticing. The kind of noticing that happens when something feels slightly off, but you can't say exactly why. The way a room feels different when someone has moved the furniture just an inch. You walk in and something is wrong and you can't name it. A farmer in Kansas named Earl Dutton heard about the vote from his neighbor, who had heard it on the radio. Earl wrote in his farm journal that he didn't understand what a Federal Reserve was. He wrote that he hoped it was good for men like him. He wrote that it had passed on a Tuesday, and that he had been mending a fence that day and hadn't known anything was happening. He wrote that it seemed like the kind of thing a man should have known was happening. That is the quiet center of all these stories. Not that something was stolen, not that anyone was cheated in a way they could point to. Just that something large had moved while most people were looking somewhere else. While they were packing bags and buying gifts and thinking about the smell of their mother's kitchen and the sound of children running downstairs on Christmas morning. December is a soft month. The year is winding down. The mind turns toward warmth and family and the particular comfort of familiar things. It is not a month when most people are watching closely, and that, more than anything else these witnesses left behind, is what makes the timing feel like something more than coincidence. Not one voice saying it, many voices spread across letters and diaries and small-town newspaper columns, all of them noticing the same quiet thing, all of them saying in their own way that the room had felt empty, that they had heard their own footsteps, that the building had a hollow sound. Now think about what it means for a room to sound hollow. A room sounds hollow when the people who are supposed to fill it have gone somewhere else. Their chairs are empty. Their desks are bare. The air sits still and cool, the way air does in a place that has been left behind. You can hear the building settle. You can hear the wind outside pressing against the glass. And if something happens in that room while it is hollow, there is no one to remember it the way it should be remembered. That is what December of 1913 looked like in Washington. Congress had been in session for months. Long months. Grinding, slow, argumentative months, full of amendments and revisions, and the particular exhaustion that comes from men who disagree about everything trying to agree about something. By the time December arrived, most of those men were tired. They were ready to go home. They had families waiting. They had fires to sit beside, and meals to eat, and the sweet relief of not having to argue anymore, at least for a little while. And so they left, not all at once, not in a single wave, but one by one, and then in groups. The members of Congress began making their way to train stations. They packed their bags. They bought their tickets. They thought about Christmas the way most people think about Christmas in the first weeks of December, with a kind of warm and forward-leaning anticipation. The year was almost done. The hard work was almost done. They could rest. The records show that by December 22nd, 1913, a significant number of congressmen had already left Washington. Some had left days earlier. Some had announced their departures publicly, the way men do when they are proud of going home, when they want their constituents to know they are coming. The halls of the Capitol were quieter than they had been in months. The restaurants near the hill had fewer customers. The boarding houses had empty rooms. This is not unusual on its own. Congress adjourns. Members go home. This is how it has always worked. But here is where the pattern begins to take its shape. The vote on the Federal Reserve Act was scheduled for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the day most families in America were finishing their preparations, wrapping the last gifts, pulling out the good dishes, watching the children grow too excited to sleep. December 23rd is not a day when most people are paying attention to Washington. It is not a day when most people are reading the financial pages of the newspaper or following procedural votes in the Senate. The men who stayed knew this. Some of them had to know this. The timing was not accidental. The bill had been moving through Congress for months. There had been plenty of time to schedule the final vote for a different week, a different month, a different season entirely. But it did not happen in a different season. It happened in the hollow days between Christmas and the New Year, when the country's attention was pointed somewhere warm and soft, and far away from the marble buildings on the Potomac. The letters and diaries from that period tell a consistent story. Men who had been present for the earlier debates wrote later that they had not expected a final vote so soon. Some wrote that they had been told the vote would wait until after the holidays. Some wrote that they had received no clear word at all and had made their travel plans accordingly, and had only learned what happened when they were already home, already sitting at their own tables, already far from Washington. One senator, writing to a colleague in early January of 1914, described the feeling as similar to missing a train. You knew the train existed. You knew it ran on a schedule. But somehow, when the moment came, you were standing on the wrong platform. That image stays with you. A train running on a schedule that not everyone had been given. Pulling out of the station on a cold December morning, while most of the passengers were still in their hotels, still drinking their coffee, still assuming there was time. The pattern is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is quiet and procedural, and dressed in the ordinary language of legislative process. But when you lay the dates beside each other, when you look at who was present and who was absent, and when the absences began, the shape that forms is hard to ignore. Not a conspiracy drawn in bold lines. Something subtler, something that looks from a certain angle like a schedule that was written for a specific kind of audience. A small one, a very specific one, the kind that stays behind when everyone else has gone home for Christmas. So picture the room. It is December 22nd, 1913. The Senate chamber in Washington sits inside a building made of white sandstone and cold marble. The ceilings are high. The gas lamps and electric fixtures throw a pale yellow light across the rows of wooden desks. Outside, the air is sharp and dry. The kind of cold that makes the city feel emptied out, like a glass someone set down and forgot. Most of those desks are bare. The men who who usually sit behind them have gone. They have taken their coats and their bags and their holiday plans, and they have left the capital behind. Some went home to their families. Some went to warmer places. Some simply assumed, as senators often do, that nothing of great consequence would happen before the new year. The session had been long. The debates had been exhausting. The bill had been argued and amended and renamed and argued again. Everyone was tired. Everyone was ready to rest. But not everyone left. The ones who stayed behind were a smaller group, quieter, more deliberate. They had watched the calendar the way a hunter watches a tree line. They knew what was coming. They had helped write it in some cases. They had spent weeks making sure the language was right, that the votes were counted, that the path was clear. And now, with the chamber half empty and the holiday settling over the city like a heavy wool blanket, they were ready to move. The vote on the Federal Reserve Act came to the Senate floor that evening. The count, as it has been recorded, was 43 in favor and 25 opposed. The rest were absent, not sick, not detained by some emergency, simply not there, gone home, standing on the wrong platform, as that senator would later write, while the train pulled quietly out of the station. 43 votes in a chamber built for 96. Now, there is nothing technically wrong with that number. A quorum is a quorum. The rules were followed. The process was observed. Nobody broke a law. Nobody had to. The whole point, the quiet genius of it, was that everything happened exactly as it was supposed to happen. The machinery of government ran the way machinery runs. It just ran at a moment when most of the people who might have slowed it down were somewhere else entirely. The men who stayed understood something that the men who left did not. Or perhaps the men who left understood it perfectly well and made a different kind of choice. History does not always tell you which version is true. What history does tell you is this: the bill that passed that night had been shaped, in its earliest form, on a private island off the coast of Georgia. It had been carried to Washington by men who represented the largest private banks in the country. It had been rewritten and renamed and softened in its language until it sounded less like a gift to those banks like a protection for ordinary people. And then, on the longest nights of the year, when the country was turned toward its families and its fires and its holiday tables, it passed. The House had already approved it earlier that same day. Woodrow Wilson would sign it into law the very next day, December 23rd. The whole thing moved with the quiet efficiency of something that had been planned to move that way. There is a particular kind of power in timing, not the power of force or argument, the power of patience, of knowing when the room will be empty, of understanding that most people, given the choice between staying in a cold marble building and going home for Christmas, will go home, and of building your plans around that simple human fact. The ones who stayed behind were not villains in a story. They were men who wanted something and found a way to get it. They used the rules. They used the calendar. They used the ordinary rhythms of human life, the desire for rest, the pull of family, the assumption that nothing important ever happens right before a holiday. They were patient, they were organized, and they were right about one thing above all else. Nobody was watching, or almost nobody. There were a few voices, a few newspapers, a few congressmen who would later say they felt something had slipped past them in the dark, that they had turned around and found the world slightly different from the one they had left, like walking back into a room and knowing, without being able to say exactly why, that someone had been there while you were gone. That feeling never fully went away. The vote happened on December 23rd, 1913. That date is not an accident. That date is the whole story, compressed into 8 digits on a calendar page. December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. The country was already somewhere else in its mind. Families were traveling. Stores were full of people buying things. Children were counting the days. The newspapers were running soft stories about the season, about charity drives and church services, and the price of Christmas trees in city markets. The great machine of American attention had turned, almost completely, toward something warm and domestic, and far away from the marble halls of Washington. And in those halls, the vote was called. The Senate passed the Federal Reserve Act that evening. The final tally was 43 to 25. 43 senators voted yes. 25 voted no. And 27 senators did not vote at all. They were not present. They had gone home. Some of them would later say they had no idea the vote was coming that night. Some would say they had been assured the session was over, that nothing of consequence remained on the floor, that they could leave without missing anything that mattered. Sit with that number for a moment. 27 senators absent. On the night that one of the most significant pieces of financial legislation in American history came to a vote, the House had already passed its version weeks earlier in September, with more members present and more debate on the floor. But the Senate version required a conference committee, a reconciliation process, a final agreement between the two chambers. That process stretched into December. And when the final, agreed-upon bill was ready for a vote, the date on the calendar said December 23rd. The men who were there voted. The men who were not there did not. That is the impossible detail. Not impossible in the sense of magic or mystery, but impossible in the sense that it should not have been allowed to happen that way. A nation's entire relationship with money, with credit, with the creation of currency itself, decided by fewer than half the members of the Senate, 2 days before Christmas, while the country was asleep to it. There is a particular quality to the silence of a government building late in December. You can almost feel it if you close your eyes and think about it. The long corridors empty, the gas lamps or early electric lights casting yellow pools on marble floors, the sound of a few voices echoing in chambers built to hold hundreds. Outside, the Washington winter pressing against the tall windows, cold and gray and still. That is the room where it happened. The men who voted yes that night were not, by most accounts, wild-eyed radicals or secret conspirators. They were senators. They had read the bill, or most of it. They believed, many of them genuinely, that a central banking system would stabilize the American economy. They had watched the panic of 1907 tear through the country like a cold wind through an open door. They did not want that to happen again. Their reasons were real, but the timing is the thing that doesn't sit right. Because here is what you have to understand about the way power moves. It rarely announces itself. It rarely stands in the middle of the room and says, "Here I am. Watch what I do." It moves in the margins. It moves in the procedural details, in the scheduling of votes, in the quiet decisions about when a session will be called and when it will be adjourned. It moves in the spaces between the things that get written down. The Federal Reserve Act did not sneak through in the dark exactly. It was a public bill. It had been debated for months. Its name was in the papers. But the final vote, the definitive moment, came at a time carefully chosen to minimize the number of people who would be in the room to witness it. That is not a theory. That is the record. The congressional record, which is about as dry and official a document as exists in American life, shows the names of who was there and who was not. It shows the date. It shows the hour. December 23rd, 1913. Evening session. 43 to 25. And then the gavel came down, and the country, 2 days from Christmas, wrapped in the particular softness of the holiday season, did not notice, or almost did not notice. A few people noticed. A few people always notice. But noticing and being heard are two very different things, and that distance between them is where this story lives. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23rd, 1913. He used a gold pen. He smiled for the people in the room. He called it a victory for the American people. And for a while, most of the country believed him. The skeptics, the ones who push back on the darker version of this story, they start here. With Wilson, with the signing. They say, look at the man. Look at what he believed. Wilson was a reformer. He had spent years fighting the big banks and the railroad trusts. He was not the kind of man who handed power to the wealthy and called it progress. He genuinely thought the Federal Reserve would tame the banks, would bring order to a system that had been wild and dangerous for 100 years. The panic of 1907 had scared people badly. Something had to change, and Wilson believed this was the change that needed to happen. The skeptics have a point. They really do. The Federal Reserve Act was not written in secret and slipped into law without anyone knowing. It had been argued over in New newspapers and in Senate chambers for the better part of a year. Ordinary citizens wrote letters about it. Farmers in Kansas had opinions about it. The debate was real. The bill was public. Nothing about its existence was hidden, and the vote count itself, 43 to 25, was not razor thin. It was not a stolen election decided by one or two exhausted men in an empty room. There were enough senators present to constitute a legal quorum. The vote was valid by every measure the law recognized. The skeptics will remind you of this. They will say that the timing, the Christmas Eve signing, the holiday session, all of it was just the normal chaos of a Congress trying to finish its work before the year ended. Legislatures do this. They always have. December is always a scramble. That is a fair argument. It deserves to be heard. But here is where the skeptics go a little quiet. Wilson himself went quiet, not right away, but later. A few years after he signed that pen across that paper, something shifted in the way he talked about what he had done. He wrote about it, not in a speech, not in a press release, in his own private reflections, the kind of words a man puts down when he is trying to make sense of something that is bothering him. He wrote that he had unwittingly ruined his country. Those were close to his words. He felt he had handed control of the nation's credit to a small group of men. He felt the system he had signed into law had concentrated power in ways he had not fully understood when he signed it. He was not a stupid man. He was one of the most educated presidents America ever had, and he said in his own hand that he had made a terrible mistake. The skeptics struggle with this. They can explain the vote. They can explain the timing. They can explain the quorum rules and the parliamentary procedure and the perfectly legal mechanics of how a bill becomes a law. What they cannot explain is why the man who signed it spent the rest of his life feeling like he had done something wrong. Wilson did not say he had been tricked exactly. He did not name names. He did not point a finger at Nelson Aldrich or Paul Warburg or any of the men who had gathered on Jekyll Island 2 years before. But the weight of what he wrote suggests he understood in the end that he had not fully seen what he was agreeing to, that the bill he signed system it created were not quite the same thing. There is a particular kind of regret that comes from realizing you were used by people smarter than you in a game you did not know you were playing. Wilson was a proud man. He would not have said it plainly, but the feeling is there in the words, like smoke in a room after the fire has gone out. The skeptics are right that the Federal Reserve Act was legal. They are right that it was debated. They are right that the vote was valid. But Woodrow Wilson signed it with a gold pen and a smile, and then spent years wondering what he had done. And that quiet, private doubt from the man who was actually in the room, who actually held the pen, is the one detail that even the most reasonable skeptic has a hard time setting aside. There were men who saw it clearly from the start. Not presidents, not senators, not the kind of men whose portraits hang in marble halls. Just ordinary men who paid attention, who read the fine print, who asked the questions that nobody else thought to ask. Their names never made the papers. Their warnings never made the history books. But they spoke, and some of them kept speaking long after it cost them something real. You have to understand what it meant to speak up in 1913. The country was still young in a certain way, still figuring out what it believed about money, about power, about who got to decide things. Most people trusted the men in good suits. Most people assumed that if something passed through Congress and got signed by the president, it was probably fine. To stand up and say otherwise was to invite a particular kind of silence, the kind where people stop returning your letters, where your name gets left off invitation lists, where the men you used to do business with suddenly find themselves too busy to meet. Some of them were farmers, men from the middle of the country, from states where the soil was the only bank that ever really made sense. They had watched the panic of 1907 roll through their towns like a slow flood. They had seen what happened when Eastern banks decided to stop lending. They had buried neighbors who lost everything in a single season. And when the Federal Reserve Act passed, they read it carefully. They talked about it at feed stores and at kitchen tables and at the edges of church parking lots after Sunday services. They said quietly that this new system did not look like protection. It looked like a lock on a door, and they were not the ones holding the key. Some of them were small-town newspaper editors, men who ran 4-page weeklies in places like Broken Bow, Nebraska, or Corsicana, Texas. They wrote editorials that maybe 500 people read. They pointed out that the Federal Reserve banks were not government banks, that they were owned by member banks, that the men who sat on the boards were not elected by anyone. They printed these things carefully, in plain language, with no anger in the words, just the facts as they understood them. And then they waited. Most of them waited a long time. There was a congressman named Charles Lindbergh, not the famous one, his father, a quiet man from Minnesota who served in the House and who voted against the Federal Reserve Act. He wrote a book about it afterward. He called the system a money trust. He said the act handed control of the nation's credit to a small group of private interests. He said it plainly, and he said it in print, and he said it with his name attached. He lost his next Senate race. He ran for governor of Minnesota years later and lost again. He kept saying it anyway. He said it until the end of his life. He never got loud about it. He just never stopped. That kind of calm, steady conviction is its own strange thing. It is not the conviction of a man who wants to be right. It is the conviction of a man who has already accepted that being right will not save him, who has decided that the record matters more than the reward. There is a dignity in that, a quiet kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It just looks like stubbornness. It looks like a man who will not change his story. The believers were not all wise. Some of them were wrong about the details. Some of them let the story grow bigger than the facts could hold. Some of them connected things that did not connect and saw patterns in shadows. That is the nature of any group of people who feel they have been lied to. The truth gets mixed with the fear, and the fear gets mixed with the anger. And by the end, it is hard to separate them. But the ones who stayed close to the documents, who read the actual text, who tracked the actual votes, who named the actual names, those men were not wrong. They were just early. They were saying in 1913 what some economists would spend the rest of the century slowly, carefully, reluctantly beginning to admit. Their names never made the papers, but the thing they were pointing at was real. The Federal Reserve was built by private bankers for a system that private bankers understood better than anyone else. And the men who said so first, in plain language, with their names attached, paid a price for it that most people never even noticed. There is a building in Washington, D.C. that most people walk past without looking up. It sits on Constitution Avenue, pale and wide, with columns that rise like old bones against the sky. The stone is the color of cream left out too long. The windows are tall and narrow, like eyes that don't blink. It is called the Eccles Building, and it is the home of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Thousands of tourists pass it every year. Almost none of them stop. That is not an accident. There is something about power, real power, that learns to make itself quiet. It does not need a parade. It does not need a monument with its name carved large. It needs only to keep working day after day in the background, like the hum of a machine inside a wall. You don't hear it, you don't see it, but the heat it makes keeps the whole house warm. The Federal Reserve became that kind of thing. It became the hum inside the wall. Think about the rivers that run through this country. The Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri. They have been dammed and rerouted and channeled so many times that the maps from 200 years ago barely match the ground. The water still moves, but it moves where someone decided it should move. The fish don't know the difference. The water doesn't know the difference. But the direction changed, and the direction was chosen. And the choosing happened in rooms most people never entered. Money works the same way. Before 1913, the flow of money in America was wild. It flooded in good years and dried up in bad ones. Banks failed like old barns in a windstorm. Farmers lost everything. Families lost everything. The country went through panics the way a sick man goes through fevers, shaking and sweating, and not knowing when the next one would come. The land held all of that. The small towns that emptied out, the fields that went fallow, the houses that stood with their windows dark for years. After 1913, the flow changed. It didn't stop flooding. it didn't stop drying up. But now there was a hand on the lever. A quiet hand. A hand that most people couldn't see and didn't know to look for. The land remembers things like that, even when the people forget. There is a stretch of Georgia coastline where Jekyll Island sits, low and green and wrapped in Spanish moss. The moss hangs from the live oaks like gray curtains, soft and still in the salt air. The island smells like mud and pine and the faint sweetness of something old. The Jekyll Island Club still stands there. The building is painted yellow now, bright and cheerful. A hotel for tourists who come to walk the beach and watch the pelicans. They take pictures. They eat dinner on the porch. They sleep in rooms where men once sat around a table and wrote the first draft of a plan that would reshape every dollar in America. The island doesn't tell them that. The island just holds the moss and the mud and the memory. That is how it works. The places where big things happened don't announce themselves. They go on being places. The grass grows back. The paint gets a new coat. The name changes. The Jekyll Island Club became a state park. The building where the secret meeting happened became a museum. The museum has a gift shop. The gift shop sells postcards. And somewhere underneath all of that, the ground holds what it holds. The Eccles building in Washington holds it too. The marble floors, the long corridors, the meeting rooms where men in suits sit around tables and decide what interest rates will be, which is another way of saying they decide how much it costs to borrow money, which is another way of saying they have a hand on something that touches every person in the country, every mortgage, every car payment, every small business loan, every farmer who needs to get through the winter. The building doesn't look like that kind of power. It looks like a library. It looks like a courthouse. It looks like a place where nothing very exciting happens. That is the point. The men who built the Federal Reserve understood something that most people don't learn until it is too late. The most powerful thing in the world is the thing that doesn't look powerful. The thing that looks like furniture. The thing that looks like wallpaper. The thing that looks like it has always been there and always will be and was never, not once, a choice that someone made in a hurry in December while most of the country was looking the other way. The farmers knew first. That is how it always goes. The people closest to the land, the ones who live by seasons and soil and the slow turn of weather, they feel a change before anyone names it. They don't have the words that economists use. They don't read the financial papers out of New York or Boston, but they feel it in their hands, in the price of seed, in what the bank offers them when they come in with their hats in their hands and ask for a little help getting through to spring. The years after 1913 were quiet at first. The Federal Reserve was new. Most people had never heard of it. Life went on the way life does. Crops grew. Children were born. The seasons turned the way they always had, gold to white to green and back again. But out in the middle of the country, in the flat, wide states where the wind comes down without anything to stop it, the farmers started to notice something. The money felt different, not in a way they could explain at a dinner table, not in a way that would hold up in a courtroom, just different. The way you notice a change in the air before a storm that hasn't arrived yet. There is a tradition in American life that goes back a long way. It is the tradition of the ordinary person who sees something that the powerful people have decided not to see. The frontier settler who watched the railroad come through and understood before the lawyers explained it that the land was being taken. The mill worker who felt the shift in wages before any union man put a name to it. The sharecropper who knew the numbers on the ledger didn't add up, even if he couldn't say exactly where the error was. The farmers who lived through the early years of the Federal Reserve were part of that tradition. They had a name for what they felt. They called it the money power. It was not a new name. Farmers had been using it for decades, going back to the years after the Civil War, when the government pulled paper money out of circulation and made everything tighter and harder and more expensive to borrow. The money power was the idea that somewhere, in some city, in some room they would never be invited into, men were making decisions about money that would reach all the way down to the price of a bushel of wheat in a small town in Kansas. They weren't wrong. There is a pattern in American history that shows up again and again in different shapes different decades, but always with the same outline. A decision gets made at the top. It gets made quietly by a small number of people in a setting that most Americans will never see. And then that decision moves outward slowly, like water soaking into dry ground, until it reaches the edges of the country where ordinary people live. And by the time it reaches them, it has no face on it anymore. It is just the way things are. It is just the price of corn. It is just the interest rate at the local bank. It is just life. The farmers in the Midwest and the South who pushed back against the Federal Reserve in those early years were not wild-eyed men with strange ideas. Many of them were the same men who had pushed back against the railroads a generation before. The same men whose fathers had pushed back against the land speculators before that. They had a long memory, and a long memory is a dangerous thing to have when powerful people are counting on everyone to forget. Some of them wrote letters. Some of them showed up at town halls and said their piece. Some of them voted for candidates who promised to look into it and watched those candidates lose or win and then go quiet once they got to Washington. This is not unique to the Federal Reserve. This is not unique to 1913. It is a story that runs through American life like a thread through cloth. The people who feel the change first are rarely the people who get to name it. The people who name it are rarely the people who fix it. And the people who fix it, if anyone ever does, are usually working from documents and records and old letters written by people who felt something was wrong long before anyone believed them. The old farmers knew something was wrong. They said so. They wrote it down. And then the years moved on, and the Federal Reserve became furniture, and their letters sat in boxes, in attics, and county courthouses, waiting for someone to open them. Some of those boxes have been opened. Some of them haven't. Some of those letters still exist. You can hold them in your hand. The paper is thin and brown at the edges, like a leaf pressed between the pages of a book and forgotten for a century. The ink has faded to a pale rust color, but the words are still there. And some of those words are angry. Some of them are afraid. And some of them are very, very specific. There was a congressman from Minnesota named Charles Lindbergh. Not the pilot, that was his son. This was the father. A quiet, serious man with a long face and steady eyes. He served in the House of Representatives for 10 years. He watched the Federal Reserve Act move through Congress. He watched the vote happen in December, and he did not stay quiet about what he saw. Lindbergh wrote a book. He published it in 1913, the same year the act was signed. He called it Banking and Currency and the Money Trust. It was not a gentle book. He named names. He described the meetings. He talked about the concentration of financial power in the hands of a small group of men. The book sold copies. People read it. And then, over the years, it faded from the shelves and out of the conversation. But the book still exists. You can find copies of it today. The pages are fragile and the print is small. But the arguments inside it are clear as creek water. Lindbergh believed that what happened in December 1913 was not an accident of timing. He believed it was a plan. He put that belief in writing, and the writing survived. There are photographs from that era that carry a certain weight when you look at them closely. Formal portraits of men in dark suits, standing in wood-paneled rooms. The men in the foreground are the ones you recognize: senators, cabinet members, men whose names appear in history books. But sometimes, in the background, slightly out of focus, there are other men whose names are harder to find, men who were not elected to anything, men who had no official reason to be in that room on that day. Their faces are blurred by time and distance, but they are there. There are letters in the National Archives written by senators who voted against the Federal Reserve Act. Some of those letters were written to constituents back home. Some were written to colleagues. A few were written to no one in particular, more like a man talking to himself on paper, trying to make sense of what he had just watched happen. One senator wrote that the vote felt rushed, that the chamber felt thin, that he had the strange sense of watching something important happen in a room that was not quite full enough for the occasion. That letter is real. It is filed in a folder with a catalog number. You can request it. A researcher did decades later and wrote about it in a small academic journal that most people have never read. The journal still exists. The letter still exists. The folder still exists. There were also men who tried to fight the act after it passed. A congressman from Ohio introduced a bill to repeal it in 1914. The bill went nowhere, but the record of that bill is still in the congressional record. His name is there. His arguments are there. He said the act gave too much power to private interests. He said the American people had not been properly consulted. He said the timing of the vote was suspicious. Nobody disagreed with him loudly. Nobody agreed with him loudly either. The bill died in committee, and the congressman was not re-elected. His papers ended up at a small college library in the Midwest. A graduate student found them in the 1970s while researching something else entirely. She made copies. She wrote a footnote about them in her dissertation. The dissertation is in a university archive. The footnote is on page 214. This is how the artifacts of dissent survive. Not in museums, not in famous collections, in footnotes, in folders, in the back shelves of small libraries where the fluorescent lights flicker and the carpet smells like old paper and nobody has checked out the book you are holding in 20 years. The people who pushed back left a record. It is scattered and quiet and hard to find, but it is there. A thin brown letter, a blurred face in a photograph, a bill that died in committee, a footnote on page 214. These are the things that survived, small and patient and still, waiting the way all old paper waits for someone to come looking. There is a particular kind of story that never makes it into books. It lives somewhere else. It lives at kitchen tables, on long car rides, in the quiet hour after a big holiday meal when the dishes are done, and the kids have gone to sleep, and the older people sit together and talk the way older people do. Low voices, careful words, the kind of talk that feels like it belongs only to the room it is spoken in. These are the family stories. Every family that lived through the early years of the 20th century had some version of it. A grandfather who ran a small bank in Ohio and came home one December night looking pale and tired. A grandmother who remembered her father reading the newspaper at breakfast and setting it down without a word. A great uncle who worked for a grain cooperative in Kansas and started keeping a second set of books after 1913, just in case, though he never said in case of what. The details changed with each telling. That is what stories do. They pick up the color of whoever is carrying them. A banker in one version becomes a farmer in the next. A specific date becomes a general season. The name of the bill gets dropped entirely because nobody could remember it, and it did not matter anyway. What mattered was the feeling at the center, the feeling that something had shifted, that the ground under ordinary life had moved quietly, while everyone was looking somewhere else. You have probably heard a version of this story yourself. Maybe not about the Federal Reserve. Maybe about something else. But the shape is familiar. The powerful people met somewhere private. They made a decision. The decision changed things for everyone. And most people did not find out until much later, if they found out at all. That shape is very old. It is older than America. It is as old as the idea of power itself. What makes the Federal Reserve story interesting is how cleanly it fits that shape. The secret meeting on Jekyll Island. The bill with 3 different names. The vote in December, while most of Congress had gone home for Christmas. Each piece of it, on its own, has an explanation. Together, they form something that feels like a pattern. And patterns are what families remember. Not the fine print, not the committee hearings. The pattern. A woman in her 80s, sitting at a Thanksgiving table in rural Indiana, might not know the name Nelson Aldrich. She might not know what a currency elastic clause is, or why it matters. But she knows that her grandfather, a careful and serious man, stopped trusting banks after a certain year. She knows he kept cash in the house. She knows he said more than once that the people who ran money were not the people you voted for. She does not know where he learned that. She only knows he believed it deeply, and that it made him careful in a way that she has never quite been able to shake. That is how the story travels, not as fact, not as argument, as a feeling passed from hand to hand like a worn coin. Some families polished the story into something sharper. The bankers were villains. The congressmen were cowards or fools. The whole thing was a theft, clean and simple. simple, carried out in the dark. Other families let the story soften over time. It became less about blame and more about the nature of things, about how the world works, about how decisions that shape your whole life can be made without you in the room. Both versions are true in their own way. The sharpened version and the softened one. They are just different ways of holding the same weight. The weight is this. In December of 1913, something changed about how money worked in America. It changed in a way that most people did not understand at the time, and that many people still do not fully understand now. The people who shaped that change were not elected. They were not accountable in any way that ordinary citizens could see or touch. And the moment it happened, the quiet December moment when the gavel came down and the bill passed, most of the country was asleep. That is the story the families kept, stripped down to its bones, passed along in low voices at late hours. The books on the shelves might tell you something different. The books might give you context and nuance and the full sweep of economic history. And maybe that is all true. But the families kept something too. Something small and stubborn and hard to argue away. The feeling that power moved, and that nobody asked them first. Now here is the part that nobody talks about much. Not the vote, not the bankers, not the island or the bill or the president's pen. The part nobody talks about is what happened after. How the story itself got quiet. How it faded from the front pages and the dinner tables and the town squares. How it went from something people argued about in the open to something people whispered about in corners. That is its own kind of mystery. Big stories don't disappear because someone erases them. That is not how it works. They disappear because other stories come along. Louder ones, brighter ones, stories with more fire and more urgency and more faces you could put on a front page. The Federal Reserve Act passed in December of 1913. And then 1914 arrived. You know what came in 1914? The whole world cracked open. Europe went to war. The newspapers filled up with maps and casualty lists, and the names of places most Americans had never heard of. The arguments about central banking and Christmas votes, and who was really in that room on Jekyll Island. All of it got swallowed up, not buried on purpose, just covered over. The way snow covers a field, quietly, completely, until you forget there was ever anything underneath. That is the first way a story gets lost. A bigger story takes its place. The second way is slower. It takes years. It works like water on stone. The institutions that were created by the Federal Reserve Act grew. They became part of the furniture of American life. The Federal Reserve became a thing people referenced without thinking about it. The way you reference the post office or the highway system. It was just there. It had always been there. And when something feels like it has always been there, it becomes very hard to remember a time when it wasn't. Very hard to feel the weight of the moment when it began. The third way is the strangest one. The story got buried under versions of itself. Over the decades, people kept telling the tale, but each telling changed it a little. Some versions grew larger than the facts could hold. Grander claims got attached to it. Darker theories. The kind of theories that are so large and so dramatic that ordinary people stop taking them seriously. And when that happens, something odd occurs. The reasonable questions get buried along with the unreasonable ones. The real strangeness of that December night gets lumped in with things that have no evidence at all. And then the whole bundle gets set aside, labeled, dismissed. That is a very effective way to lose a story. Let it grow too big to carry. Then watch people put it down. But underneath all of that, the original thing is still there. Small and plain and stubborn. A small group of men met in secret on an island off the coast of Georgia. They wrote a bill. That bill changed its name and its shape several times before it reached the floor of Congress. It passed in December, close to Christmas, when many members had already gone home. The president signed it into law, and the institution it created has shaped the financial life of every American since that day. That is not a theory. That is just what happened. The mystery is not whether it happened. The mystery is why it feels like a secret. Why so many people, when they first hear the full shape of the story, feel a small jolt of surprise, like they are hearing something for the first time that they probably should have heard a long time ago. Maybe the schools didn't linger on it. Maybe the textbooks moved quickly past the details. Maybe the story of the Federal Reserve just never had the drama that other stories had. No battle, no famous speech, no single face to put on a monument, just a vote, a quiet one in a half-empty chamber on a cold December night. And then morning came, and the country woke up, and most people went about their lives without knowing that something had shifted underneath them. The way you don't notice the tide going out until you look down and your feet are dry. The families who kept the story, the ones who passed it along in low voices, they weren't keeping a conspiracy. They were keeping a feeling. The feeling that something important happened and the world moved on too fast to notice. That is a very human thing to hold on to. That is a very human kind of grief. Some stories don't get buried because they are false. Some get buried because the world just kept moving, and the story had to run to keep up. Then came the professors, not the famous kind, not the ones with their names on buildings or their faces in magazines. The quiet kind, the ones who spend their whole lives in small offices with tall windows, surrounded by boxes of old paper that nobody else wanted to read. They came along decades after the vote, decades after the ink dried on Woodrow Wilson's signature, decades after the men who were there had grown old and gone quiet and passed on. These professors came with their reading glasses and their notebooks and their patient, careful eyes, and they started pulling at the threads. You can imagine them. A single lamp burning late in some university archive. The smell of old paper all around. That dry, dusty smell like the inside of a forgotten drawer. Stacks of documents sorted by year. Ledgers, letters, congressional records going back 100 years. The kind of material that makes most people's eyes glaze over. But to these men and women, it was a map, and they were following it. What they found was not a smoking gun. It was something quieter than that. It was a pattern, a shape in the data. The kind of thing you only see when you step back far enough to take in the whole picture. They found the attendance records. They found the vote tallies. They found the letters that senators sent home to their families in the days before the vote. letters that mentioned travel plans and holiday dinners and long train rides back to their home states. They found the newspaper clippings from that week in December 1913, the ones that talked about the weather and the Christmas markets, and the general feeling that Congress had mostly wrapped up its business for the year. And they found the bill, the one that had changed its name 3 times, the one that had started as something else and arrived at the floor of the Senate wearing a new coat. They traced its path through committees and back rooms and late-night conversations. They mapped the names of the men who pushed it forward. They noted who was present and who was not. None of it was hidden exactly. That was the thing that kept surprising them. The receipts, as people say now, were right there, filed away in the public record, available to anyone who knew where to look and had the patience to look long enough. It is a cold night where you are standing now. Picture it, the Capitol building in the dark, its white dome pale as bone against the winter sky. The streets around it quiet, a few lights burning in a few windows. The Potomac somewhere nearby, moving slow and black under a thin skin of ice. The bare trees along the mall standing still as sentinels, their branches like dark ink lines drawn against the stars. This is the city where it happened. This is the ground where those men walked, where they shook hands and made phone calls and drafted language and counted votes and decided that this was the night. This was the week. This was the moment. You are small under that sky. We all are. The dome above you has seen 150 years of decisions, most of them forgot, most of them buried under the weight of everything that came after. But the professors found this one. They dusted it off. They held it up to the light. What they wrote was not dramatic. Academic papers rarely are. They used careful language. They said things like the evidence suggests, and it appears that, and the record indicates. They were not conspiracy theorists. They were not trying to start a fire. They were just trying to tell the truth as cleanly as they could. But the truth, even told quietly, carries weight. The weight of a vote taken in a half-empty room. The weight of men who went home for Christmas and came back to find the country had changed while they were gone. The weight of a system so large and so permanent that that most people alive today have never once stopped to wonder where it came from, or who decided it should work the way it does. The professors found the receipts. They published them. They moved on to other projects, other archives, other small offices with tall windows and the smell of old paper in the air. But the receipts stayed. They are still there, in the record, in the public files, in the kind of places that are open to anyone who wants to go looking. The cold night air moves through the bare trees along the mall. The dome glows soft against the dark. The river keeps moving. The stars hold still. Here is where things get complicated. Not scary, not dark, just complicated the way real things usually are. The conspiracy theorists found this story. Of course they did. A secret meeting on a private island. A bill passed in a half-empty room. A new system of money built in the quiet of a December night. That is exactly the kind of story that travels fast through certain circles. And when it travels, it picks up extra weight, extra meaning, extra villains. Some of what they said was true. That part matters. The meeting on Jekyll Island did happen. The men who attended did hide their names. The bill did pass on December 23rd, when most of Congress had already left for home. The Federal Reserve did give private banks a role in shaping the nation's money supply. These are not theories. These are facts. They are in the record. The professors found them. The documents confirmed them. But then the story kept going. And that is where it drifted. Some people said the whole thing was a plot by a small group of foreign families to control the world's wealth. Some said the Federal Reserve was never a real government agency at all, just a private club wearing a government mask. Some said the men on Jekyll Island had planned it all decades in advance, moving pieces on a board the rest of us couldn't see. The story grew. It grew the way stories always grow when they touch something real and then keep reaching past it. Here is what is true. The Federal Reserve is not a fully private institution. It is not fully public either. It lives in a strange middle space that even economists argue about. The regional banks that make up the system are owned by member banks, but the Board of Governors is appointed by the President. It is a hybrid, a compromise, a thing built by men who could not fully agree, and so built something that held pieces of every argument. That middle space is confusing, and confusion is where legend grows best. The men on Jekyll Island were not cartoon villains. Nelson Aldrich wanted a system that protected banks. William McAdoo wanted a system that protected farmers. Woodrow Wilson wanted something he could sign without feeling like he had handed the country to Wall Street. None of them got exactly what they wanted. That is usually how law works. Messy, partial, full of trade-offs that satisfy nobody completely. But the conspiracy theorists were not entirely wrong to feel suspicious. The process was not clean. The secrecy was real. The timing was real. The way the bill moved through Congress, changing its name, changing its shape, waiting for the right moment, that was real too. When you look at the whole picture, it does not look like an accident. It looks like a plan. And plans made in private by powerful men about something as important as money deserve to be looked at hard. What the conspiracy theorists got right was the instinct, the feeling that something important happened without enough people watching. That feeling is correct. It is historically correct. The Federal Reserve Act changed the country in ways that most Americans never fully understood. Not in 1913, not now. The people who felt that and said so out loud were not crazy. They were paying attention. What they got wrong was the certainty. The story of Jekyll Island does not need a secret brotherhood or a hidden master plan to be remarkable. The plain facts are remarkable enough. A group of wealthy men met in secret. They wrote a bill. They waited. They passed it. The country changed. You do not need to add monsters to that story. The story already has enough weight on its own. There is a kind of person who, when they learn this history, feels a cold anger settle in their chest. There is another kind of person who shrugs and says this is just how power works, always has been, always will be. Both of those people are responding to something real. The anger is real. The resignation is real. Neither one is the whole truth. The whole truth is quieter than either of them. It is the truth of a system built by imperfect men in imperfect circumstances that has lasted more than 100 years. and shaped every dollar that has ever passed through your hands. It is the truth of a vote taken in a half-empty room that most people alive today have never heard of. That is not a conspiracy. That is just history. History that moved quietly in the dark while most people were home for the holidays. And that somehow makes it feel even stranger than the theories do. There is a man named Earl Pritchard who grew up in a small town in eastern Kansas. His grandfather had been a wheat farmer. His great-grandfather had been a wheat farmer before that. And somewhere in the space between those two men, the family had lost a piece of land they never got back. Earl did not know the details when he was young. He just knew there was a bitterness in the house, a quiet kind of grief that lived in the walls. His grandfather would sit on the porch in the evenings and look out at the flat horizon and say almost nothing. But sometimes, when the light was going orange and the cicadas were loud, the old man would say something like, "They changed the rules on us." And then he would go quiet again. Earl moved to Portland, Oregon in 1971. He was 23 years old. He drove a second-hand truck with a cracked windshield and a box of his grandfather's papers in the back seat. He did not know why he took the papers. He just did not want to leave them behind. For years, the box sat in a closet. Earl worked in a print shop. He got married. He had 2 kids. He lived a full and ordinary life. The box stayed closed. Then, in 1987, his wife found it while cleaning out the closet. She brought it to him at the kitchen table and said, "What is all this?" Earl opened it for the first time in 16 years. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings from 1913 and 1914, a pamphlet with the words "currency reform" printed across the top in heavy black ink, and a handwritten note in his grandfather's careful script that said simply, "Look at who voted and when." Earl read everything that weekend. He sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light and read until his eyes hurt. His wife brought him coffee. His kids watched television in the other room. The house smelled like pot roast and dish soap. And Earl Pritchard, wheat farmer's grandson, print shop worker, father of 2, felt something shift inside him. He could not have explained it precisely. It was not anger, exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you finally understand a joke that everyone else laughed at years ago. A slow recognition. A sense that something had been happening all along, and he had simply not been looking at it. He started asking questions. He wrote letters to libraries. He drove to the university and asked a librarian to help him find records from the congressional session of December 1913. He was not a scholar. He was not a journalist. He was just a man with a box of his grandfather's papers and a feeling that the story was not finished. What he found was not a smoking gun. There was no single document that proved a grand design. What he found was more like a shape in the fog, a pattern of timing, a list of names, a vote taken on a winter evening when the chamber was nearly empty. The same things that historians had noted, the same things that had never quite been explained away. Earl wrote it all down in a notebook. He made copies of the documents. He sent some of them to a small newsletter in Portland that covered local history and alternative politics. The newsletter printed a short piece. A few dozen people read it. That was the end of it, more or less. Earl did not become famous. He did not start a movement. He went back to the print shop on Monday morning and ran the machines and came home for dinner. But he kept the notebook. And when his daughter was in high school and studying American history, he sat with her at the same kitchen table and walked her through what he had found. She listened. She asked good questions. She wrote a paper about the Federal Reserve for her class and got a B+. She still has the notebook. She lives in Seattle now. She teaches middle school. Sometimes she tells her students that history is not always made by the people in the textbooks. Sometimes it is made in quiet rooms, at odd hours, by people whose names you will never learn. And sometimes the only ones who notice are the people who were already paying attention, the ones who had already lost something, the ones who had a grandfather who sat on a porch and stared at the horizon and said, "They changed the rules on us." That is how a story lives in exile, not in archives, not in headlines, in a box in a closet, in a notebook passed from hand to hand, in a daughter who remembers what her father told her the yellow kitchen light. So why does this story keep coming back? Not the conspiracy version, not the version with shadowy figures pulling strings in smoke-filled rooms. The plain version, the simple one, the one that just asks, what happened in December of 1913, and who was in the room when it happened? That version keeps coming back because it never fully goes away. Every few years, someone finds the notebook. Not that specific notebook, sitting in Seattle in a closet, but their own version of it. A grandfather's letter, a dog-eared paperback with margin notes in pencil, a forum post from 2003 that links to a scan of a congressional record. Someone finds the thread and pulls it, and the whole thing unspools again, fresh as the first time. There is something in this story that refuses to settle. Most historical mysteries have a shape to them. They have a beginning, a middle, and a place where the trail goes cold. You can point to the cold spot. You can say, here is where we stopped knowing. But this story does not have a cold spot. It has a warm one. It stays warm because the thing at the center of it is still here, still running, still shaping the price of bread and the cost of a house and the number on your paycheck. The Federal Reserve is not a ruin. It is not a ghost. It is an institution that operates right now today in buildings with marble floors and security guards and press conferences. And that is the strange part. That is what keeps the legend alive. When you wonder about something that is gone, the wondering has a ceiling. You can only go so far. But when you wonder about something that is still here, still making decisions, still setting the rate at which money moves through the country, the wondering has no ceiling at all. It opens up like a night sky. People come back to this story because they feel something in their daily lives that they cannot quite name. The rent goes up. The savings don't stretch the way they used to. The number in the account stays the same, but buys a little less each year. And somewhere in the back of the mind, a question forms. Not a sharp question, a soft one, a wondering, who decided this? How did this start? Was there a moment, one specific moment, when the rules changed? And then someone hands them the notebook. The story also keeps coming back because it is, at its heart, a story about trust, about whether the people who built the system were building it for everyone or building it for themselves. That question does not age. It was alive in 1913. It was alive in 1971 when the dollar left the gold standard. It is alive right now in the comment sections and the kitchen tables and the college dorm rooms where someone is reading something for the first time and feeling the floor shift under their feet. You do not have to believe the darkest version of this story to feel the pull of it. You just have to believe that large decisions are sometimes made in small rooms. That timing is not always accidental. That the names in the textbooks are not always the names that mattered most. If you believe any of those things, even a little, the story of December 1913 will find you eventually. And when it does, it will not feel like a revelation. It will feel like a memory, like something you almost knew, like a word you had on the tip of your tongue for years, and finally heard someone else say out loud. That is the open door this story leaves behind. Not an answer, not a verdict, just a door standing open with warm light coming through it and the faint smell of old paper and wood smoke. And on the other side of that door is a room where a few men sat around a table in December, while most of the country was thinking about Christmas, and made a decision that is still being made in some form every single day. You can walk through that door if you want. You can read the records. You can count the votes. You can trace the names and the money and the meetings on a private island in Georgia where the birds moved through the marsh grass like slow gray smoke. Or you can stand in the doorway. That is allowed too. Some questions are not meant to be closed. Some questions are meant to be carried, passed from a grandfather to a daughter, to a classroom of 12-year-olds who are just starting to wonder why the world is shaped the way it is. The door stays open. It always has. So here you are, on the other side of that story. The fire has burned down to its last orange coals, and the room is warm and dim, and outside the night is doing what the night always does. It is just being the night, quiet and wide and full of things that don't need your attention right now. You can let your eyes close. The story is told, or as much of it as can be told in one sitting, because a story like this one doesn't really end. It just reaches a place where the teller goes quiet and the listener carries it forward. That is how it has always worked. That is how it will keep working long after this voice fades and the room goes still. Think about a dollar bill for a moment. Just one. The kind that sits in your wallet or your coat pocket or the bottom of a bag you haven't opened in weeks. It is a small green rectangle. It has a face on it. It has numbers and symbols and tiny fine line printing that most people never stop to read. It feels like paper, but it isn't quite paper. It is something in between. Something that took a long time and a lot of decisions to become what it is. That bill passed through 1,000 hands before it reached yours. A cashier in a diner. A child getting birthday money. A man paying rent on a cold Tuesday. A woman buying medicine. Each person held it for a moment and then let it go. And the whole time it was moving, it was being shaped by something most of those people never thought about. A system, a set of rules, a structure that was decided in large part by a small group of men in a wood-paneled room in December of 1913, while the rest of the country was hanging wreaths and wrapping gifts and thinking about anything other than monetary policy. That is the quiet thing. Not a monster, not a villain, just a structure, old and invisible. The way the bones in your hand are invisible until you think about them. Jekyll Island is still there, you know. The marsh grass still moves in the wind off the Georgia coast. The birds still drift through the low gray sky above the water. The old hotel where those men gathered is long gone, but the island itself remains. Visitors walk its sandy paths in the morning light. Children chase crabs along the shore. The live oak trees hang over the roads with their long arms draped in Spanish moss, silver green and swaying, like something out of a painting someone half remembered from a dream. The island doesn't know what happened there, or if it does, it isn't saying. That is the thing about places where history was made. They go on being themselves. The grass grows. The tide comes in. The light changes from gold to gray to gold again. The secret meeting becomes a footnote. The footnote becomes a legend. The legend becomes a story that someone tells late at night to into a room full of people who are almost asleep. And somewhere in that chain, something true survives. Not the whole truth. Truth is too big to carry whole, but a piece of it, a shape, the outline of something that really happened, passed down through years and arguments and late-night conversations and books that most people never finish. You don't have to decide tonight what you believe about the Federal Reserve. You don't have to pick a side. The historians have their version. The skeptics have theirs. The old farmers and the conspiracy theorists and the economics professors all have something to say, and none of them agree completely, and that is fine. That is how it should be. What you can do is carry the question gently, the way you carry anything worth keeping. Not too tight, not too loose, just present, just alive in the back of your mind where good questions live. The fire is almost out now. The coals are dark red, breathing slow. The room is the color of amber and shadow. Outside, the stars are doing their old work, turning slowly above a country full of sleeping people, each one carrying a wallet, each wallet holding a few small green rectangles that move through the world like water, shaping everything they touch. That is the quiet thing that shapes every dollar in your pocket. A decision made long ago in a room you were never invited into by men who knew exactly what they were doing. And the story keeps going. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night, one tap, and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.